This discussion paper examines the changes in real wages of British workers from the late 19th century to the early 21st century. The paper challenges the common assumption that rising real wages are solely due to labor productivity growth by using annual data on wages and productivity. It finds a positive link between productivity and wages, but productivity growth alone does not fully explain the variation in real wage changes. The paper then investigates the role of trade union bargaining power as an additional factor impacting real wages, demonstrating that unions were able to direct income increases to their members, particularly during periods of rising union membership. The paper ultimately concludes that both labor productivity and trade union influence are important in understanding the historical trajectory of real wages for British workers.
Yeah, we're diving deep into a paper. Let me get the title right here.
Oh, yeah, it's by John H. Pencavel, right?
That's the one. An analysis of the changes in British workers' real wages since the 19th century, published just this past July.
Hot off the presses. And it tackles this big question. What made British wages explode over the last 100+ years?
Six-fold increase, to be precise. Someone in Britain today, on average, is making 6 times what their great-great-grandparents did back in 1893.
Talk about a raise. So 6 times the buying power, but...
And that's just the average. Some folks saw even bigger jumps, depending on their industry.
Right. So before we get into what caused that, we got to make sure we're all speaking the same language here. This paper talks about real wages, but there are actually 2 types.
Yeah, it's a key difference. Imagine you're a blacksmith, right? Your product wage is how many horseshoes you make in a day. But your consumption wage is how much stuff you can buy with the money you earn for those horseshoes.
Okay, I like that. So it's like what you produce versus your actual buying power.
Exactly. And what's wild is both these types of real wages in Britain went up at almost the same rate over this long period, but year to year. Different story.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting. The year-to-year changes, those fluctuations, they tell us more about what was really driving wage growth, right?
Exactly. Now, classic economics 101 would say, higher productivity equals higher wages.
Makes sense, right? If you're producing more, you should earn more.
Right. More output per worker means a bigger pie for everyone. But like most things in economics, it's not that simple.
There's always a catch. So what's the catch here?
Well, the data in the paper does show a link between productivity and wages, but it's not as strong as you might think, especially when you look at consumption wages.
You mean what workers could actually buy with their money wasn't always keeping up with how much they were producing?
Yeah, it's like the pie is getting bigger, but the slices aren't always growing at the same rate for everyone.
Okay, so if it's not just about working harder or being more productive, what else is going on? What's driving these wage changes?
Well, there's another big player in this story that we haven't talked about yet. Trade unions.
Ah, yes, the power of collective bargaining.
Exactly. And when we look at the history of unions in Britain, things get really interesting.
So we left off talking about unions, and I know when a lot of people hear unions, they think about, like, strikes and demands. But how are they actually pushing wages higher?
Right. It wasn't always confrontational. Sometimes it was about making sure workers got a fair share of the pie, especially as companies became more productive.
Okay, so like if a business figures out how to make twice as much stuff, the workers should see some of that extra profit, right? Not just the bosses.
Exactly. Economists call it rent sharing. Basically, when companies do well, some of those gains should go to the workers who help make it happen.
Makes sense. And it sounds like unions played a big part in making sure that happened, at least for a while.
Yeah, and the data in this paper really backs that up. There's a strong link between higher union density, meaning more workers in unions, and faster real wage growth.
Yeah.
Especially between like the 1890s and the 1970s in Britain.
Okay, so stronger unions, bigger paychecks. But then union membership started to decline, right? Did that mean wages just stopped going up?
That's a great question. And it shows why economics can be so tricky. Because even though union power in Britain fell after 1980, real wages kept rising.
Really? So even with fewer people in unions, wages still went up. That kind of messes with the whole unions equal higher wages idea.
It does, which tells us there's got to be more to the story. The economy is complicated, right? It's not just one thing causing another. There are all these other factors at play.
Okay, so what are some of those other factors? What else might have been pushing wages up even as union membership dropped?
This is where the research gets even more interesting. Because the paper also looks at things like unemployment rates and how those played a role.
Right, because if unemployment is low, that means companies have to compete harder for workers, right? They got to offer better pay to attract people.
Exactly. Basics, supply and demand. The tighter the labor market, the more leverage workers have. And then there's inflation, which is the whole other can of worms.
Yeah, inflation. Always got to love inflation. But basically, when prices go up, workers need higher wages just to keep up with the cost of living, right?
Right. No one wants a pay cut because their rent doubled overnight. So you've got productivity, unions, unemployment, inflation, all these things pushing and pulling on wages at the same time.
Sounds like a lot to keep track of. But that's what makes this kind of research so important, right? Because it shows that the economy isn't just some abstract thing. It's the result of all these real-world forces interacting.
And we haven't even gotten into the social and political factors that play a role. The point is, it's complicated. But this research gives us some really important clues about what was driving those big changes in British wages over time.
Absolutely. So even with all this data, there are still some big questions, right? Like, why did wages keep rising even as union membership fell?
There are always more questions. And that's kind of the fun part, because it forces us to keep digging, keep learning, keep trying to understand how this complex system we call the economy really works.
It's like a giant puzzle, and we're slowly putting the pieces together. Speaking of puzzles, here's a question for everyone listening. Okay, so let's say we could jump in a time machine, go back to, I don't know, 1950s Britain, knowing what we know now about wages and unions and all that.
Okay.
What would you do? Would you sign up, get yourself a union card?
Tough one. It's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, join the union, get those sweet wage gains.
Wait,
But
because back then you didn't have all this data laid out, right?
exactly. It was more than just, will this get me an extra shilling a week? It was social, political.
Like, are you with us or with them kind of thing?
Totally. Plus, unions weren't perfect, then or now. But this paper does make you think about the power of collective action, you know?
No doubt. Even today, that's still a big question. How much can we actually impact these huge economic forces?
It can feel daunting. But even just understanding how those forces work, that's a step, right? Like this Pencavel paper, it's just one slice of a much bigger story.
Yeah, it's got me wanting to read up on British economic history now, see what else I can find.
Right. There's got to be tons more research out there, just waiting for someone to dive in.
And who knows, maybe something we talked about today will spark an idea for your next deep dive. So if you're listening, hit us up. Let us know what economic mysteries you want us to tackle next.
And until then, keep those curiosity gears turning.
Absolutely. We'll see you in the next one.